This
He'd
beauty's
like
got
to
the torque to
finalize the
handle anything.
purchase, and suddenly
Impressive. What's the
chairs
fuel
were
efficiency
offered.
like? And the
Coffee
safety
appeared.
features? Looks very
Apologies
reliable.
stumbled out awkwardly. But Elias didn't seem to notice, because in his mind, he wasn't in the showroom anymore. He was back on the side of the highway 3 years earlier, snow blowing sideways as he fixed a blown tire with numb fingers while trucks roared past without slowing. He was remembering the nights he'd promised himself that if he ever stood on solid ground again, he wouldn't forget what it felt like to be invisible. And so when the paperwork was done and the keys were laid out in neat rows, Elias didn't gloat, didn't scold, didn't demand special treatment. He simply thanked the young associate by name, because he'd asked for it, and told him to remember that listening costs nothing. And then he left. 5 brand-new Mercedes trucks rumbling out of the lot behind him like a quiet parade, and the dealership staff stood watching, stunned, because they'd laughed at what turned out to be their biggest mistake, though they didn't yet realize how big, because the twist came months later when the story spread through the industry, when word got around about how Elias Crow had been treated, and competitors took notice because Elias's new logistics company, reborn under a new name, began winning contracts at an alarming rate, not just because of efficiency or pricing, but because companies trusted a man who'd seen the bottom and climbed back up without cutting corners. And then came the lawsuit, the one Elias filed against his former partner, backed by evidence he'd quietly gathered over years, evidence that led to criminal charges and the collapse of a once-respected firm. And when that firm's assets went up for auction, guess who bought the building that now housed the Mercedes dealership? Guess who became the landlord overnight? And the irony of it hit like a punch to the gut when the manager received the letter announcing the change in ownership, signed simply, Elias Crow. And yet even then, Elias didn't seek revenge, because when he visited the building for the first time as its owner, he walked through the showroom dressed the same way he always did, simple, practical, and he watched how customers were treated, how staff spoke when they thought no one important was listening, and he made changes, not dramatic firings or angry speeches, but quiet policies that rewarded respect over appearances, listening over assumptions, and the young associate, the only one who hadn't laughed, was promoted. Not because Elias owed him anything, but because character deserves opportunity. And years later, people would tell the story differently, embellishing it, turning Elias into a myth, a secret billionaire in disguise. But the truth was simpler and more American than that, because Elias hadn't been testing anyone, hadn't been playing a trick. He'd just shown up as himself, worn down but unbroken, asking for 5 trucks because that's what the job required. And the laughter that followed had revealed more about the people laughing than the man they laughed at. And if there was a lesson Elias carried with him, it was the one he shared whenever someone asked how he'd made it back from nothing. He'd say that money can vanish overnight, but who you are when no one thinks you matter, that's what lasts. And somewhere out on the highways of America, 5 Mercedes trucks still run routes that began with a man in ragged clothes standing calmly in a showroom full of laughter, proving that underestimating someone might just be the most expensive mistake you ever make. Narrative, approx. 5,000 words. The first thing everyone noticed about the ragged man was that he didn't belong there. Not in the polished marble showroom where the air smelled like fresh coffee and money, where chrome reflected light like mirrors, and the Mercedes emblem hung above the entrance like a promise meant only for the well-dressed. And yet he stood there anyway, shoulders straight, despite the frayed coat hanging off his frame, eyes calm in a way that made a few of the salesmen uncomfortable, even as they laughed under their breath, because when he spoke, his voice was steady and low and carried across the room as he said he wanted 5 Mercedes trucks, not 1, not 2, but 5 heavy-duty models, the kind construction companies financed over decades. And the laughter came fast and sharp, a manager actually snorting as he asked if the man had taken a wrong turn from the shelter down the road, another salesman waving him toward the door with a smile that wasn't kind. And still the man didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He just repeated himself and added that he'd pay in full, which set off another wave of laughter because everyone there could see the holes in his gloves and the dried mud on his pants. And nobody bothered to ask his name, though if they had, they would have heard him say it quietly. Elias Crow, because names matter, even when people pretend they don't. And Elias remembered a time when this very building hadn't existed, when the lot had been a weed-filled stretch of land where he'd parked his first rusted pickup while sleeping in the cab after working 16-hour days hauling scrap metal across state lines. And as the manager shook his head and signaled security, Elias did something unexpected. He reached into his coat, not for cash, but for a folded piece of paper, old and creased, a contract that one of the junior sales associates, young, unsure, not yet hardened by commissions, noticed and hesitated. Something about the man's calm gnawing at him, and that hesitation changed everything. Because before security could escort Elias out, the young associate asked what kind of trucks he needed, and Elias answered with exact specifications, axle loads, torque requirements, long-haul efficiency metrics, details no homeless drifter would know unless he'd lived inside the industry, and the laughter faded just a little. Enough for curiosity to creep in, enough for the manager to pause and say, "Fine, 5 minutes, make it quick." And in those 5 minutes, Elias told a story he hadn't planned to tell, about a company that once bore his name before a partner stole it through forged signatures and legal loopholes, about how he'd lost everything in a single winter when a lawsuit froze his accounts and creditors circled like wolves, about sleeping in truck stops and church parking lots, not because he wanted pity, but because he refused to quit. And the associate listened while the manager checked his watch and the other salesman whispered bets. About how long before security dragged the man out. And then Elias did the second unexpected thing. He asked them to pull up the VIN numbers of 5 specific trucks on their lot. Trucks that had been sitting unsold for months because of minor cosmetic issues and a market downturn. Trucks the dealership was quietly bleeding money on. And when the manager asked why, Elias smiled for the first time and said, because those trucks would be perfect for the routes he already had contracts lined up for. Contracts that required delivery starting next week. And when the manager scoffed and said, contracts with who? Elias named companies, real ones, national ones. And the room went quiet enough that the hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt loud, because those companies were known, trusted, and extremely selective. And now the manager's smile stiffened as he asked how a man who looked like Elias could possibly have contracts with them. And Elias answered simply that reputation doesn't disappear, just because your bank account does. And then he asked for a phone, and when the associate handed him one, Elias dialed a number from memory and put it on speaker. And when the voice on the other end answered, an executive, recognizable to anyone in the industry, the laughter didn't come back, not even a little, because the executive greeted Elias by name and asked if he was calling about the trucks, and the manager felt his stomach drop as Elias said yes, 5 of them, and that he was standing in the showroom now, and the executive laughed, not mockingly, but warmly, and said good, because the advance had already been wired. And just like that, the manager's face drained of color, because the associate pulled up the dealership's account, and there it was, a pending transfer large enough to buy 10 trucks. And the ragged man everyone had laughed at handed the phone back and said he'd like to finalize the purchase, and